Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
Today we're going to be talking about...
Critical people are not critical thinkers. So, just to play on words there, because, a lot of times people think they're critically thinking when they're being critical.
Right.
But that's, the thing is then they're just being critical.
Right, they're just being critical.
They're not really critically
right.
thinking.
If you say the movie was bad, you've not necessarily thought about the movie. You've just uttered your preference. It seems like
it sounds
seems like it.
Like it's you've been critically thoughtful.
Yeah, because you came to the opinion that it's bad, and most people will say it's good. So you kind of stand out because most people will see a movie and say it was nice. But the fact that you said it wasn't good then it makes you feel like you're a critical thinker because you're standing out. You're kind of different. But really, you could just be preferential. You could be difficult, and maybe actually the movie was amazing, but you're just saying it's bad so that you stand out and you get some sort of social capital. And we associate being critical with being smart.
Yeah, and with being critical thinkers. I think that a lot of times the reason why that happens is because, when somebody's being critical, well, one, they don't think they're being critical. They often don't think they're being critical in the negative sense of that word.
Right.
Though they do think they're analyzing. They think they're properly analyzing.
Right.
And usually they think, well, I can do that because I can see your situation better than you can. Because you're in the middle of it or in the midst of it and you can't actually see what's really going on. I can.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's definitely...
I think that happens a lot.
Yeah, that definitely does. And there's kind of this sense...
Like, they think they have, kind of perspective on it.
Yeah.
Because they're not you, for example. And so they think, well, I'm actually able to have more of a better... ability to think on this.
Yeah, and it could be just that they're worrying, but nobody who's worrying thinks they're worrying. They think they're being wise. And I guess with that language of critical thinking, then if the person is just being critical, which, like you note, very often people don't think they're doing. They think they're seeing the situation correctly.
Yeah.
But that language of critical thinking as someone who's smart probably contributes to the concealment.
100%.
Because they think, if
they're
you
like,
did...
well, I'm doing my critical thinking now, and I'm also trying to help you, so I'm not wrong at all. I can't be.
Whereas,
which I think...
whereas if in society you instead had a language of, say, constructive thinking or dynamic thinking, that self-deception, that self-hiding that can occur, that can conceal the critical person from the fact that they're just being critical, not discerning, it might be more difficult for them to carry out the mental gymnastics that they are actually being helpful and insightful.
Right, and perhaps they have better perspective with their distance.
Yeah, perhaps.
But
it's
not necessarily.
Given. Yeah.
And also, often somebody can think that's the random chicken sound from a toy.
Yeah, well, we can critically examine it and talk about how dumb the toy is, and we'll be smart and know
how amazing the toy is.
Yeah, there you go. But the social incentive is to say how bad it is, so that it sounds like we would make a better toy, right? That's the other thing. It's like there's an incentive to be critical because it makes you sound superior to.
That's kind of interesting. I know it's so true, and it's very impactful in relationships, very damaging in relationships. I've always thought that criticism is just very, very, very damaging.
Yeah.
It just is, because there's just so, unfortunately, there's very little understanding often in that.
Oh, yeah.
But like your terms that you like to use, which I think are so great, where you're kind of explaining what's going on, but you're never really addressing the person.
Right.
Because you've already decided this is the way it is. This is. But it's funny because now that you're talking about it again, I guess it is true that most times criticism is negative.
Oh, yeah.
It's not like you call oh, I really like your lip gloss as that's not critical.
Don't call it critical. No, we don't call that. Well, we're very skeptical.
Which is interesting because maybe it's very critical that the person know their lip gloss is amazing.
Oh, but that's the thing.
It's a weird. It's
that's why the language is so bad.
Yeah, it's so bad.
If you would have had dynamic thinking, that makes space for saying your lipstick looks nice, because you can be a dynamic thinker in the positive. But critical really bends us in the direction of the negative. Yeah. It's like if 100 people say they like your short story or they like your talk, and one person says it's bad, you assume the one who said it was bad is the smart person, and everyone else is more valid.
And that's so true too. We kind of assume that the thing that was negative or was that's somehow more true.
Yes.
Maybe it's true, but it shouldn't be the case that it's necessarily more true.
And it might be true. And there is something to be said about social niceties where people will say something good that's bad. But here's the thing. if we had a better, metaphors matter, and the only metaphoric language, like the predominant metaphoric language we have for thinking about being intelligent, is the language of critical. And that biases us way too far in the direction of the negative, where if we had language like constructive, dynamic, I mean, there is constructive criticism, but look, the language of constructive is always in the context of the negative. It's constructive criticism. Right. And that means you're also, the other thing with that language is that you are receiving something to critique. You know, someone is giving you something to tell you what you think about. So the onus is on other people. You know, the thinker is not the person who's creating, but the thinker is the person that judges.
And tears down.
And tears down. And, you know, constructive feedback. You know, so all the language, so our language for thinking is receptive and judgmental and negative. Our language for thinking...
Like
reactive. Our language is not constructive, creative, and affirming. We don't have a balance. Whereas, you know, if, again, like we said, if it was like dynamic thinking as opposed to critical thinking, you might get a balance between the negative and the positive. I mean, you need there's three things. You have construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. Very often construction, if it didn't have any feedback in the initial construction, can be bad, so you need to deconstruct the bad parts, but then reconstruct them good. You need this kind of threefold action. And we've gone very far in the direction of deconstruction. Now, someone like Derrida himself, I think, understood this problem, and he always thought about deconstruction as being in service of a new construction. But many of the deconstructionists who followed Derrida have not been so discerning. Now, if you ask them directly, they'll say they are. They just happen to never get around to the reconstructing. It's just like, you know, people will do lip service to the importance of creativity and creative thinking. It just happens that they themselves never do it, and every creative idea they're presented with is bad. You know, there's always these kind of ways that we present the world to ourselves so that we can convince ourselves that we're not overly critical when we are, that we're not overly against creativity when we are. We're always about to accept creativity. We're always about to start being affirmative. We just never get to it.
Well, right, and I think you're so spot on with the idea that it would be great if it was another word, you know, because I think if we think about critical thinking and it's like, you know, Platonic form and like it's good sense, you know, if we think about it in like the actual right way, then it's a very important skill. It's a very important thing to have.
Yes, and we have a paper going through of an affirmative understanding of the term, like a movie critic, like someone who sits back and looks at the way that thought structures reality towards you and examines it. So if we can think of critical thinking like a critic, like a movie critic, and you're a critic of your own thinking, and then better yet, we link it up with empathy, we can try to fix it. But that's a different topic. I mean, here it's focusing on the real problem of the metaphoric language.
Right, because I mean, if it was, it's almost like you don't even want it. It's instead of championing for critical thinking, it would be better to have like creative thinking, literally creative thinking, because then you're really kind of sharpening your own ideas with your own ideas. And yes, you'll encounter other ideas, and that's very, very important. And you need to be able to see if those will stand the test. Like, will they hold water?
Right.
Will they hold
of
water?
Of course.
Right? It's like the language does really impact. See, we kind of just wait. We just sort of wait. It sounds like we got our little sword.
Yeah.
We're just kind of waiting for another sword, and then we go choo choo. Instead of like, you know, actually being like a swordsmith or something, where you're like actually creating multiple swords for different angles or different, you know, purposes.
Well, we basically are incentivized to sit around and wait for other people to create things, and then when
we can just chop down.
And then when they do, we chop them down.
Yeah. And then we call ourselves critical thinkers.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we are intelligent to attack. And so all the incentive, all the social capital, all the social honor goes in the direction of the people who don't create, but instead judge. And there's incentive to be difficult, because the difficult person, the one who's hard to please, can then be perceived as being the most insightful or the most intelligent or the less fake, the more true, because they're not just going along with the social niceties. Now, again, there's something to be said about social niceties and social politeness and givens and all those things as potentially hindering thought, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that just because people have always done X, that therefore X is bad. You know, it might be the case, but the language of critical thinking sets you up to just assume that anything that exists is broken. And you have to find problems in things that exist, and you have to find problems in relations. Like, relationships aren't real until there's drama. for example. There's no reality until there's something critical, until there's criticism or a critical situation.
Yeah, well, and that's like we were talking about with the word itself, critical. Critical condition, it's a very medical term, where it's like, okay, it's kind of related to the word crisis, where it's like, it's either they're going to survive or they're not going to survive. And the fact that it's used in that way, critical care, critical condition, it's like, it's interesting because often it's the apocalyptic situations or that then bring out people suddenly now they're thinking and they think they've always thought. Right? It's like these critical, fatalistic, apocalyptic situations, the crises, that then make people critically think or think they've been critically thinking.
Oh, yeah.
Now they have to think, but they kind of like want to give themselves, I mean, we all do this as humans.
Sure.
It's very, very common. And it's, we can all do this where it's like, well, you sort of just give yourself the benefit of the doubt. Like, oh, I've always been thinking. And this is, my now thoughtful decision has been informed by my rigorous thought when really it's reactive thought. But you kind of feel like you have to, and you feel very certain with your critical, with kind of more of a judgment versus an assessment, right?
Right.
Because you feel like you must, because it's critical, right? It's the whole nature of it is it's like urgent.
Well, what ends up happening is a lot of critical thinking is rushed.
Yes.
But by definition, we can't think that our thinking is rushed because we wouldn't think that it was good. And if we didn't think it was good, we wouldn't have trust in our decisions. So we have to engage in a lot of rationalization that when we enter into places where it's critical that we think, that it's urgent we make a decision, then we have to engage in mental gymnastics to believe that we make a good decision and that we were prepared.
Mental gymnastics.
Yeah, it's mental gymnastics, and up down, and so we do a lot of that to make sure what we're doing is good, and we also think that we're critically thinking if we're thinking about something dire, but you could think poorly about something dire. Like there's almost this assumption that if you're thinking about a critical subject, that therefore you're critically thinking about it, and that kind of almost makes an assumption that you're thinking deep and well about it, but you're actually it's almost like a transfer of an assumption of depth from the fact that the subject you're thinking about is deep. But it's very possible to think foolishly about a deep and critical subject. It's very possible to think shallowly about a deep and important subject. But there's this weird thing with the very fact that it's a deep and important subject makes you feel like you're therefore critically thinking because you're thinking about a critical subject. So there's these sort of mechanisms of hiding, of self-deception, of rationalization, that the language of critical thinking, that metaphoric structure, makes it easier to fall into that mistake.
Yes.
Whereas if you had the language of dynamic thinking or comprehensive thinking, then you couldn't make the mistake so easily of going, I'm thinking about a critical subject, therefore I'm comprehensively thinking. Well, that doesn't really follow. The language doesn't really follow. But if you go, I'm thinking about a critical subject, therefore I'm critically thinking, well, the language seems to follow, so it's easier to believe that you're in fact critically thinking because we've created this language that aids. The language aids self-deception. The language aids convincing ourselves we've thought when we have not thought. It gives us more mechanisms of hiding from the reality that we have not thought as well as we should have.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the reason why I think it's important to parse this out is that, the thing is that criticism, as I mentioned, is very, very
poisonous.
Yeah, very, very poisonous, toxic. It's very toxic, and a lot of times the person doing it, they usually feel like they're being very thoughtful.
Yeah, they feel like
and usually it comes from a place of like, why would you critically think if it didn't like ultimately lead to like a better life, or like that you wouldn't be, usually a lot of times too, criticism happens in within relationships, and it's like the person usually like loves the person.
Yes.
So but it's just interesting because then I think the reason why it's important to understand how critical, and then this idea of urgency and this idea of how criticism, the words are just so similar, and yet they're used for these very vastly different things, because criticism and actual critical thinking are not the same.
Not the same.
And they're very far from each other in many respects. And to understand the difference can help, because then you can sort of keep yourself in check. I think it's easier to check yourself when you have the language for it, when you have the language for, oh, right, criticism and critical thinking are not the same, or when I'm going to be critical and I think I'm being like very informed or insightful or something,
Oh, that's
like
right.
I maybe should just pause for a bit and maybe reevaluate this.
Well, I think the language of critical thinking was supposed to be associated with self-criticism, like being critical of your own thinking, going deeper into what you believe.
Yeah.
But gradually that was lost, and now it's just critical of what's
That's
external.
no fun.
Yeah, that's no fun. So now it's critical of what's external to
Right.
you, critical of people. And yeah, there's something also too about, you think that if you're critically thinking, you're trying to change the situation. But here's the thing: if someone in the relationship is doing something you don't like them to do, then what you're using critical, quote unquote, critical thinking in service of your preference and your ideology and what you think and how you think people should act. But you're able to convince yourself that that's not what you're doing, that in fact you're being a critical thinker, because the language of critical thinking and criticism are so close together that, again, it creates another mechanism where you can actually just try to bend people to your preferences and convince yourself that you're being smart and that you're being wise. But again, it's not real thinking, because the thing is, one of the aspects about true critical thinking is where you're able to actually see issues or problems or complexities or ways the world work that do not readily present themselves to you. They're not just there. But when someone in a relationship is not doing something you want them to do, say they're not eating the food you think they should eat, or maybe they're spending...
They're not sharing their clown costume with
yeah,
you
they're not
I mean,
reference early OG Rose conversation.
conversation.
So they're not sharing your clown costume. Well, there's no actually thinking, because it's just there. They're not giving you their clown costume. So there's no looking for, there's no seeing deeply. It's actually presented. But it feels like there's depth, because here's the thing: it sometimes can be hard to say something that you think will upset the person, or it's going to create an uneasiness, and you confuse the feeling of that uneasiness with the feeling of going deep, because you perhaps have not ever critically reasoned about which feelings belong to which actions, so you confuse the feeling of the uneasiness of a situation with critical thought, when that has nothing to do with critical thought. But you've never taken the time to examine what emotional experiences go to what activities. That emotional uneasiness that happens in a relationship is a sign of criticism. But you've never thought about that, so you associate it with critical thought. And so the very anxiety and collapse that happens in the relationship, or the death of the emotional stability in the atmosphere, becomes evidence that you're doing the right thing. And so then you keep doing it, and you keep that evidence there, and then everything falls apart.
100%. And also there's kind of a martyr feeling, I think, to that person, because they feel like, well, I don't really want to have to say this.
Yes.
It's hard for me to say this.
Yes.
And look, that, like, whatever the person has to say, like, maybe there's some truth to it, maybe not. The thing is that the nature of how it is discussed, how it is presented even, is going to make a big impact on how it's received.
Yes.
And if it even makes a difference, or if it makes things just more difficult between the two people, or between the people. And I think, that it's so true what you say, that the feeling of this is hard to do often makes people feel like, well, I must be critically thinking.
Yeah, I must be right.
I must be right.
Because
even though and there's even this, like, well, I wish I weren't right, like, I wish I weren't, I don't want to have to talk to you about this or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, if you don't want to talk to me about this, why are you talking?
Oh, sure.
Well, I guess it is true that if there's no thought on, wait a second, what does this feeling really mean? See, this would be starting to do real critical thinking.
That's the problem.
What does this feeling really mean? How would it be if I told this person this? Would it make a difference? Has it made a difference in the past?
Is that difference
what
actually
could be
good?
a different way of telling them this thing, which maybe is, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt that maybe it's even true or good.
Yes.
Well, how could I present it in a way that actually makes a change?
Yes.
What could I do maybe instead of say?
Yes.
So that's the type of critical thinking that really needs to be done. And maybe, I don't know, I mean, is the feeling of it's harder than the thinking of the actual thinking about it?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of things. Emotions do not tell you what they mean. We conclude what emotions mean. So if something feels uneasy, we decide if that uneasiness is a sign that we're doing the right thing or that we're doing the wrong thing. Right. It's not necessarily self-evident. So you have to think about it. You see, that's kind of the problem. Like, emotional intelligence as opposed to just emotionalism. Emotional intelligence is the ability to discern the meaning of emotions and to discern also empathy. You get into all those other things. But you see, of course, that means having the correct understanding of emotions, and if they're a sign that you're doing the right thing or a sign that you're doing the wrong thing, would require critical thinking.
Yeah.
And if you assume that being critical is necessarily the same as critically thinking, well then 9 out of 10 times, what's the emotion that will come with that? The emotion will become the drama, the kind of that anxiety you feel in the family. So you literally come to attach that feeling with being smart, with being discerning. And so then with loving. And so if that feeling is not there, well, then you believe you think you're not doing something right. So what ends up happening, like in life, so many of the great, so much of the most important lessons in life is to actually realize that the name of the game is to avoid these self-feeding situations where you avoid attaching an emotion that confirms you're doing something right with something that's wrong. Because if you make that misattachment, well, then you're going to always be thinking you're doing something right as you're doing something that makes it worse, of which may make more of the emotion that you think is evidence you're doing something right. And you get this spiral situation. Like the name of the game in life is to avoid these spiral situations, these self-feeding, these snakes eating their own tails.
Yeah, and like the irony.
You know, irony.
Well, and also it makes me think a little bit of from scripture about like my yoke is easy and then my burden is light, because it's interesting because this feeling of, okay, this is hard, but I'm going to say it anyways because I know I'm like right with this, but it's difficult for me to say, and then all of the drama that can therefore ensue, or the impact it makes on a relationship, that all becomes very hard actually. That can become very burdensome. And if they're good people, they'll work it out and it'll be fine in the end, and that's okay. But it can become very burdensome. And it's like, I guess what I mean to say is like, would it really be that much more of a burden to just think about something? Like think through it critically? I mean, because if I don't know, personally, it's almost like, well, if I just think about something in my head, like sure, there's a little bit more of like grappling I have to do, but that's a lot lighter than not doing that, and then just or like marital drama or familial drama or friendship drama, because I didn't just take some time to do that. You know what I mean? It's just interesting because it's like, okay, we associate, I don't know, maybe we just sort of unconsciously think like, okay, it'll be really hard for me to think about this, so I'm just going to go ahead and make this, I'm just going to go with the heart of this feeling.
Well, I mean,
it's like almost like, oh wait, wow, like actually maybe what could be like the right way, right, quote unquote right way, but like the way that actually critical thinking would actually be a much more light burden.
Well, I mean, there's a few things. One, if you yourself did not have to go through any ego death, if you didn't have to go through any hard thought of examining yourself, and you just went straight to saying the hard things to the other person about how they're in the wrong, then that would be problematic because you haven't gone through your own purgatory, right? So the likelihood that what you think is actually accurate is probably lower. Second, once you begin associating the real with drama, then people believe that they have to continually create drama in order for there to be to be real in the relationship. And so hard then gets associated with real, right? And also, if the hard is not shared by everyone in the family, then the real relationship is isolated to individuals who are just thinking in their head about the situations. So there's actually this weird incentive to spread the hardship to the entire family or to the entire business or to all the other artists so that everyone is in the real and we're all on the same page.
Maybe there's a thought of like, well, that could actually be a lighter burden because we're all sharing it now.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Share one another's burden.
Yes, we're all in it together and we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Also, too, most people don't accept the premise that thinking about subjects make a difference. They don't accept the premise that philosophizing or reading books or different things make a difference in their life because, of course, in order to get that, you would have to do the critical thinking, the real critical thinking. You see how it's a total depravity? I mean, I'm no Calvinist, but that term in Calvin of total depravity is quite useful because there is something about like like if you don't enter into critical thinking, you don't even really know the value of critical thinking. So the loss is always total. Loss is always total in these contexts. Yeah. And it is, if you don't understand like what the difference of a mental model, like knowing the difference between love and like, for example, as we talk about in a paper, if you don't see how that has real practical impacts on your life, then it is hard to believe that you yourself getting your own mind straight would have a practical impact on the dynamics of the family versus telling the person what they're doing wrong. It's hard to believe that it makes a difference because you don't really deep down believe that ideas make a difference. You don't believe ideas change things.
It's funny because you act still in a way that they do, because why would you be telling them a certain concept?
But that's a philosophical realization. There, that's a meta-analysis where you've stepped back and gone, well, surely you must be thinking that ideas matter if you're voicing ideas. Well, that's a meta-analysis. They don't think they're voicing ideas. They think they're representing reality. And I know that you see, like, philosophy are these kind of abstract ideas. It's like, what good are these mental models and epistemologies and different things? I think most of the time, most people, when they talk, they don't think they're exchanging ideas. They think they're exchanging representations of reality.
That's interesting.
They're explaining reality to you. These are things they've seen. These are things they've observed. But of course, the philosopher says, no, they're all interpretations. No, they're all your takes on it. But that is a philosophical realization, that it's all interpretations. Again, interpretation is what other people do. I just read, right? That's a philosophical realization, that there's something that interpretation is always what other people are doing. It's never what you're doing. You're the one who sees clearly. So again, another thing that philosophy teaches you is that you're not just simply observing reality. You're not just simply representing. You're not just you're interpreting. Yes. You are an active agent in the creation of your understanding about reality. So like you say, you understand if you're talking to someone, you're exchanging ideas. But for most people, they don't think they're exchanging quote unquote ideas. They think they're exchanging information, data about what actually occurred.
I wonder if that's like become more and more. I mean, I guess it's always been a potential
because of the internet and the cell phone.
Yeah,
and
like I mean, images. We live in a very image-driven society with social media.
Yes.
Right, like media, the news, media. So there's a lot of images. There's a lot of solidified. Here's this image of what should be or whatever. And it's kind of like we're just kind of all basically just holding up little images to each other all the time.
Yeah, our ideas of how this should be or how this should go.
Well, we don't think of them as ideas. We think of them as, like you said, data, like basically concrete fact.
Yes.
And what's concrete, but an image.
Yes.
It's kind of more, there's something like about that
it's
idea.
Just there. It's just presented. It's just represented.
Yeah, it's not an idea. It's just there.
Yes.
And therefore here, this is just there that you should be, for example. So it's not an idea, even though obviously an idea is what made that image, of course. Yeah. But it's the thing before the image, and therefore because you can easily overlook it, right? Because you see the image, you don't see the idea.
Right. Well, there's definitely something about living in an age where you can get the answers to everything on your cell phone, where you can look up data that makes us feel like we're just exchanging information, that we're not an active agent in the present. And that gets into, with Cadell, the absolute versus the truth. We don't think there's an absolute, which is a relationship between the subject and the information that makes up the world. We think that there's just a truth, which is everything that is the case. So we're just sharing information.
Right.
And so again, being a critical thinker then is just someone who shares the information that's hard to share. And then all the social incentive is there, because then if everyone else is just sharing information and there's not really social incentive to create, and if the social capital and incentive is on the favor of being a critical thinker, well then you're not going to have a lot of constructive thought. You're not going to have a lot of creative thought. You're not going to have a lot of philosophical thought. You're going to have a lot of critical and representative thought. And that's what ends up happening.
No, I think it's important. It's very important to get that. And again, I think the best thing to do is kind of take criticism and start to put on yourself first. You know, and that's good. That's a good thing. It's not, it's a good thing to start there and really ruminate on those types of thoughts on on your own thinking.
Yes.
So do the self-criticism.
Yes.
And that, I think, will get you a little closer to what actually is critical thinking versus criticism.
Oh, yeah. And again, metaphors matter. You know, we've chosen this metaphor of critical thinking, and that has had big impacts on us, on society, but that's a philosophical realization, again. And so, you know,
Yeah.
Metaphors matter. We would have been far better off to use language like dynamic thinking, constructive thinking, comprehensive thinking, dialectical thinking. But perhaps because subconsciously we like thinking that we're a critical thinker, if we're critical, then maybe subconsciously we've, as a society, grabbed on to the metaphoric language that strokes our ego a little more and makes things easier for us. And that sets us up to be smart just because we're a judge. And it's nice to be a judge because you're not the one under judgment.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But anyway, this has been OG Rose. Critical people aren't critical thinkers. There's also a paper on critical thinking that you can find.
Yeah, and you can find this on Medium, this particular
Medium.
blog article. Oh, yes, we're also on Anchor.
Yep, Anchor and YouTube.
So, Anchor, YouTube, Instagram, Medium, and Facebook. Do check us out if you get the chance, and thank you so much for listening this evening.
We appreciate it. Thank you very much.